All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Gardner. Thanks for coming this morning, not morning, afternoon. So today I'd like to talk about something that I've been playing around with a little bit, and that is the Biometric API. So I've gotten to do a little bit of work previously with the previous implementations of this API on the platform. And there's some new stuff that's come out that I think will be a really big benefit to Android as a whole, make things a lot easier for us as developers. So yeah, my name is Brian Gardner. I work for a company called Big Nerd Ranch. Y'all may have heard of us. We make a lot of programming books, stuff like that. So I'm one of our instructors. Soon to be author, as we're releasing the 4th edition of our Android book. Should be early next year. Kotlin, architecture components, fun stuff like that. So be on the lookout for that. So I guess I can start this talk by kind of covering, well, what are biometrics? It's kind of a funny word. So to kind of distinguish what this word means, we can just kind of break it up into its component parts. We have bio and metrics. Metrics being measurements, bio being like of the body. So it's basically just body measurements is effectively what it means. Now, biometrics has been a particular field for a while, but it is kind of steadily gaining popularity in computer security areas, mostly because, well, people don't want to type in their password all the time on their phone because, well, for whatever reason. But using something like face recognition or fingerprint scanners is much easier for users to do. It's really fast and might not be the most secure thing ever, but for most people it's good enough. So these are a few types of biometrics. Again, like facial and fingerprint scanning is going to be what we typically use on mobile devices. But there were some other cool ones I saw. So there is this new research in the gait recognition, basically how you walk. So there was a study done that even if the face of the person was obstructed, they could still tell who the person was based on how they walked. Something similar is with typing rhythm. So the way you in particular type can basically be linked back to you as a person. So if you have enough data that you can crunch, you can basically tell who a person is based on how they type. Maybe you type certain characters a little quicker than other people. Those can kind of be tied to you. But again, you're probably not going to set your phone up and walk in front of it to unlock it. That would be a little strange. So we'll kind of focus on the first ones there. Now, security on Android is a big thing, has not always had the best reputation of having good security. Apple has kind of always taken the crown on that one, but it is getting better. Biometrics kind of form the sort of triangle of security in this case. So you have knowledge, possession, and biometrics. So knowledge basically means authenticating by something you know, something like a password or a PIN code or like a swipe lock thing on your phone. Possession, on the other hand, is something that you have, something like a token. So passports are kind of a physical token that dictates who you are. That's kind of like token-based security. Biometrics, on the other hand, are something that you are. So not something you know or have, but something you physically are. Like, I can't change my fingerprints, so that's a pretty decent recognition of who I am as a person. Now, biometrics, I should point out, are not, I said this a little bit, but the most secure of these things. Something like strong passwords are going to be better on average than biometric security. But you can kind of use them in tandem with these other things just to kind of speed things up. So one thing, I'm going to, quick aside here, fingerprint readers have always kind of been a little iffy in their usefulness, or security, rather. People have known that you can kind of crack fingerprint security measures relatively easily, but there was a paper that came out pretty recently that somebody in my master's program linked me, and I'm just going to read it because it sounds cool. Deep master prints, generating master prints for dictionary attacks via latent variable evolution. They are training generative adversarial networks with real fingerprints. Basically what this means is that they had 2 neural networks, one to generate fingerprints and the other one to basically determine if they were real or not. And they wanted to basically create seemingly real fingerprints. So they had initially like 5,400 like ink fingerprints that they scanned in, and then about 500 fingerprints from capacitive readers. And they basically just trained it a few 100,000 times, and they generated some really good fingerprints. And what basically came out of it was they found that on most like average fingerprint readers, one of their generated fingerprints could unlock 1 in 5 fingerprints. So got to be a little bit careful with these things, which is why I was saying you don't want fingerprint unlock to be your only access into a system. You're going to typically want to use it in tandem with something like a password. But this research is still relatively new. The research paper is linked down at the bottom there if you would like to read it. It's a really cool read. A lot of big words that I don't fully understand, but there's a lot of pretty pictures in there. So if you've been doing Android for a little while, you'll know that the Fingerprint Manager has been around since API level 23, or Marshmallow, and shortly after that they came out with the compatibility version. Now I labeled this old news because Fingerprint Manager is now deprecated as of API 28. So you shouldn't be using that anymore. There's cool new stuff, so you should be using that instead. So the reason they wanted to introduce something new is because, well, Fingerprint Manager only works with fingerprints. Shocking, I know. And a lot of devices are coming out with things like facial recognition and iris scanning and things. And the Google team basically could say, well, we could make a different manager for each of those things, but then the developers will have to implement each of them and pick which one they want to use based on the specific device. And that would be really bad. So they basically did away with this and then generalized everything to the new Biometric Prompt API. So this API is very similar to the Fingerprint Manager, if you've used that before. So I'll be covering kind of the general API and things like that, and then I'll get into some problems with it, some solutions to those problems, and then a general authentication flow that you can kind of use. First things first, permissions, because nothing in Android is ever free. There's the use biometric permission that you just have to add. Basically replaces the use fingerprint permission from the Fingerprint Manager. So you just throw that in your manifest. It's not a runtime permission or anything. It just automatically is granted. Next, you're going to create your biometric prompt object. So this is basically kind of dictating how it's shown on the screen. So the Fingerprint Manager, you used to have to make the dialogue yourself. You had to like put the fingerprint vector image in there, get everything looking right according to material design. It was kind of painful. So fortunately, Biometric Prompt handles all of that for you. You just have to give it the content to display. So in this case, the biometric prompt uses a builder pattern. So you provide a context object because it's putting stuff on the screen and doing stuff like that. So that's what the this is on the first line there. And then, of course, you have a build function to build your prompt. The two pieces of required data that you have is you have a title, which is just the title of your dialogue. And then you have to specify the negative button. So there's just a cancel button in the bottom left. If the user doesn't want to use the biometric prompt, they can do that. So you just have to provide the text for that button. And then you have to provide an executor and a listener. Now the listener just fires whenever the button gets clicked, basically. And the executor just tells it what thread to run on, basically. In this case, this is on API level 28, so the main executor is a new property. I think it's on the context or context wrapper class, but it just gets you access to the main thread executor because I just want it to run on the main thread. So. The listener, not super exciting, if I'm honest. It's just a regular dialogue on click listener. I'm not using the parameters there, but if you're interested, the first one is the dialogue. The second is an integer that tells you which button is clicked. But in this case, we have one button, so again, not super exciting. Inside of this listener, you would typically go to a login screen if you weren't already there. If you are already on the login screen, maybe you show a message and be like, hey, you didn't want to use biometrics, okay, just log in with your username and password. Now, when you want to trigger authentication, there's actually two different ways of doing it, depending on what sort of authentication you want. The first one is the one you'll probably use most of the time in your applications. So you call authenticate. You give it a cancellation signal object, which just allows you to cancel the prompt if you would like, an executor, and then another callback. So this is very similar to the negative callback. The executor tells you where the callback is going to get executed. So this is what you're going to use if you want to bypass username and password authentication for fingerprint. You'll call this, it'll show the prompt on the screen, they'll verify their fingerprint, and you can let them go on after that. The second version of the authenticate method is tied to this crypto object. So the other three parameters are the same, but the first parameter is a crypto. So basically, you can create like signatures and signing keys in Android, and you can dictate that, hey, this thing, the user has to authenticate in order for it to be used. So you would use this version to basically do that authentication. So you're like, oh, I need to sign some email before it gets sent. The user has to authenticate. You call this method. They verify their fingerprint. Everything's happy. So it's there. Don't know how often you would use it. Kind of guess it depends on your use case. So the cancellation signal, not a very exciting object, literally just lets you cancel the prompt. So the user, again, can cancel if they hit the cancel button, if they hit the back button, if they tap outside of the dialog prompt. So they have a lot of options for canceling. But if you want to cancel it in code, you have to use this object. So you basically pass it, and then at some point, if you want to cancel it, you just say, hey, cancel. It'll dismiss the prompt, and the user won't see it on the screen anymore. Now, one thing to know about the cancellation signal is if you do call cancel on it, that is kind of like permanently set to cancel. If you try to show another biometric prompt with the same cancellation signal, it's going to check and say, oh, hey, this thing's already canceled, and then dismiss the prompt again. So once you hit cancel, you'll have to create another cancellation signal if you want to show another dialog. Now the crypto objects, again, this is more of like an aside. It's not the main kind of track here, but I'll show it anyway. So the crypto object is part of the biometric prompt. It's like a subclass of biometric prompt, and it basically just wraps another cryptography object. So you've got signatures, ciphers, and MAC objects. And this kind of comes into play when you create these objects. So I'm not a security specialist, so I don't really know much about that, but I do know that when you generate these particular crypto objects, there's a function you call setUserAuthenticationRequired. You set this to true, and it basically says, hey, anytime you want to use this thing to maybe sign an email or something, the user must authenticate in order for it to use, or it won't work. So once you set this, this is when you'll use that second authenticate method. So it's like, hey, I need to sign an email, prompt for the fingerprint, verify it, and then you'll be able to use it. So the callbacks are a little bit more exciting. So if you've ever done the Fingerprint Manager before, you'll recognize that the callbacks are pretty much exactly the same. You've got 4 callbacks that you have. You have on authentication succeeded. This is the happy path. This means, yes, the fingerprint or whatever was recognized. So you get an authentication result. If you are using the crypto authentication, then that object has your unlocked crypto. So you just go grab your crypto object, grab the signature or cipher or whatever, and then you can use it. If you're just doing regular authentication, you'll probably just like send the user to a different activity inside of this callback. The on authentication error, on the other hand, is the really sad path. This basically means that like something really bad has happened and like the user cannot try the biometric authentication anymore. Most commonly it's going to be if the user is like trying to input the wrong finger on the Fingerprint Manager too many times. It basically forces a timeout. So it gives you like an error to display. And this is a terminal event, so once you get this, you won't receive any more callbacks. On authentication failed is a little bit nicer. It basically just means, well, you tried once, it didn't work, but it allows the user to try again. And help is, well, trying to be helpful. So some sensors can basically detect if there's like dirt on the sensor. So it can be like, hey, the user, you should like clean your sensor to get a better reading. So it gives like a little help string to tell the user what to do effectively. So once you set all these things up, you get this lovely little prompt. So you got your title up at the top, you got this little vector icon, and then your cancel button in the bottom left. So this is the default prompt. This is what it looks like on API level 28. The sad things happen. So when you try to authenticate and press the wrong finger on it, you'll note that I didn't have anything in that authentication callback, and that's the actual authentication callback I used for this case. So I don't have to manage the vector image here. I didn't have to put a message on there. The biometric prompt handles all of that for you, so it's very easy. You don't have to deal with any of that kind of stuff anymore. If you have too many sad prompts in a row, so too many failures, you basically get the error condition. So in this case, I input the wrong fingerprint too many times, got a timeout, so it dismisses the dialog, get the on authentication error callback, and the user basically has to wait for a little while in order to try again. Now, if you want to make the prompt have a little bit more information, there's two other fields you can set. So there's a subtitle and a description if you would like. I don't honestly know why you would need that much information on the prompt itself, because the prompt isn't super big, but your subtitle is right below the title, description is right below that. So depending on what you're having the user authenticate for, maybe you'll include a little bit more information that says, hey, log in instead of using your password, or maybe, hey, use your fingerprint to sign this email or something like that. Now there's a problem, and that problem is that the biometric prompt is only available on API level 28 and up. So I don't know who has Min API 28 right now, probably not many of you. As far as I know, I don't even think API 28 has shown up on the Android dashboards yet, so not many people. There is, however, good news, and that is that last week I found out that the Android X library has a biometric prompt. It is still Alpha 2, so it is very, very early still, but it's available, so good news on that. So I'm going to cover the differences between the framework biometric prompt, which I just showed, and the Android X version. But again, is Alpha 2, is still very early. API will probably change, so just keep that in mind as things move forward. So one of the big differences with the Android X version is that it does not use a builder pattern to create the biometric prompt object. It just passes the things right into the constructor. So we pass in a context object, which is the this on this slide, your executor, and your authentication callback. Now, you'll note here I'm not using the main executor that I used on the previous example, and that's because the main executor property is only available on 28 and up, which is a little sad. So to get around that, I basically created a fake, not a fake executor, but I basically checked and said, hey, if I'm on API 28, give me the main executor. If not, give me this gross executor that'll just immediately run whatever it's given. So probably better ways of doing this, honestly. I'm hoping the main executor comes to the Android X library soon in the future, just because it's pretty convenient for these kinds of cases. It probably will. So that's another little hurdle to watch out for. Another nice thing is the authentication callback has lost one of the methods. There is no longer an authentication help method. Since the biometric prompt handles updating all of the text on the dialog itself, we don't really need that information anymore because the dialog handles it for us. So they got rid of the help since we don't have to do anything with it, but we still have the succeeded, error, and failed functions. So they all work the same, still get the authentication result, still get the error code and error string in the error function. So everything should kind of translate over pretty easily. So you might be wondering, well, where does the actual title and description information come into play? They introduced a new object called the prompt info. So instead of setting that on the biometric prompt itself, you have a prompt info where you set it instead. So this does use the builder. So you have your title. See if this works. Yep. So you have your title and your negative button here. But you'll also note that we don't have to pass a listener to the negative button anymore. I guess the Android team figured out that nobody was really using the negative button for anything because you're probably already on a login screen when you're showing the biometric prompt. So you don't really need a listener for that. It just dismisses the dialog now, and you'll get You actually get the on-authentication error callback if the user cancels it, but your error code will tell you that they actually canceled it. So you can kind of handle that there instead. Now, when you want to trigger the authentication, in this case, you just call the authenticate method on the biometric prompt, and you pass in the prompt info. So you say, hey, show me a prompt with this information, please, and that'll put it up on the screen. Same as the previous version, if you want to pass in the crypto object, you can do that as well, but in this case, it's the second parameter, not the first, so just kind of take note of that as well. Now, when you put this up on a screen, you'll notice that it looks exactly the same as the biometric prompt from the framework on API 28. So they do look exactly the same. So that's good. For the old prompts, you'll note that these look the same as the old Fingerprint Manager styles. So if you look on the Material.io website, they have a whole section for the fingerprint prompt, like how much padding you need, what kind of vector image. So it looks exactly the same for that. The errors are still handled for you, so you get that nice vector animation to the exclamation point. You get the not recognized text put up. Same for the error case as well. It'll give you the exclamation point and then just dismiss the dialog. There's also no cancellation signal, which is nice. So they basically have hidden that away from the implementation. So instead, you just call cancel authentication on the biometric prompt object, does the exact same thing. I'm assuming they have a cancellation signal built into the biometric prompt now, and that'll basically do the exact same for you. All right, so there's two biometric prompts. You'll most likely use the built-in, or not the built-in, the Android X version. That one works down to API level 23, because that's where Fingerprint Managers came out. Before that, it basically functions as a no-op. If you try to display it, it'll just give you the error and say, hey, you don't have fingerprint hardware. So you can kind of handle it that way. So I'll go through a couple authentication flows here. Basically, like when should you display things, how to kind of get everything set up. And the main question you kind of have to ask when you're first starting is, has the user already used biometrics to sign in? So if they've already used their fingerprint to sign in, then you just basically want to prompt them to do it again. If they haven't already used it, you kind of treat it as like a first-time onboarding flow. So you'll have them authenticate the regular way, username and password, and then you want them to confirm their fingerprint. So for the first-time flow, again, just show them your regular authentication screen, so username, password. Once the user enters their information, clicks OK, you do your server stuff. Once they're authenticated, you'll basically check to see if they have the capability of using the biometric prompt. Now, you could just immediately call the biometric prompt and try it, and then handle the error on authentication error. I'm not a huge fan of doing it that way because I'd rather just not call through to that API if I don't have to. So in this case, I'm basically just checking to say, hey, am I at least on API 23 and do I have a fingerprint reader? If so, they're able to use the biometric prompt. Otherwise, I return false. So if they don't have biometrics, they've already successfully authenticated, so you just send them to whatever your landing page is, and the user is none the wiser. If they do have the feature, you're going to basically want to prompt them to use the biometrics. You'll basically say, hey, you have a fingerprint reader or maybe Face ID or something. Do you want to use that instead to authenticate? So if they click cancel, no harm. You just, again, send them to your landing page. If they click OK, then you basically need to confirm that they own the device. So they have to have a valid fingerprint, valid iris scan, things like that. So then you would basically pop up a biometric prompt, say, hey, please confirm your fingerprint or whatever in order to use this in the future. So if they successfully scan, you basically just set a flag, says, hey, they used biometrics, send them off. If it fails too many times, maybe you just show them a message, be like, hey, try again next time or something. And then when they come back to this page, you can just try it again. Now, the main flow is a little bit different. So this flow is when they've already used their biometrics to authenticate already, and you're basically going to skip by the username and password. So you don't want them to have to do that. You probably already have like a server token stashed locally that you can use for your requests. So you'll just pop up the dialog and say, hey, use your biometrics to authenticate. They'll do that, get into the app. And so forth. If they fail too many times, you'll typically want to show a message that basically says, hey, we don't recognize your biometrics, please authenticate with username and password. Depending how tight your security might be, you might also trash your server token at this point as well. So if they're re-authenticating with username and password, you're probably generating another token. So you could just trash the local one to make sure that if somebody else has the device and they're trying to access these things, they no longer have access to that data. All right, future stuff. So again, Biometric Prompt Compat is Alpha 2. That is still very, very early. And the regular biometric prompt is API 28 and up, but I don't think anybody's actually going to use that, if I'm honest. You're better off sticking with the Compat library because then you get more people on it. So currently, Biometric Prompt does only work with the fingerprint scanner. That's the only biometric they have. Google is currently in talks with other OEMs about other biometrics, but they're being very picky about it, mostly because they want to make sure that whatever biometric options they are basically safe enough. They have a threshold for how many false acceptances those things are allowed to have. I believe it's around 7% or something like that. So they're basically doing a ton of testing for iris scanning, facial scanning, and things like that. Once those technologies get to the point where they're safe enough, they'll be added into the biometric prompt scanner. So I'm hoping for APIs in the future that you can basically check at a high level and says, hey, does this thing have biometrics? So don't have to check for fingerprint or do each of these individual checks, but you can basically just get a true or false from the API itself that says, yes, they have biometrics, or no, they don't. So I think that'll probably come out when more options are in play, but who knows how long that'll be. Hopefully, the Biometric Prompt API will be going relatively stable soon. I know it's still Alpha 2, but I'm hopeful. So once it hits beta, it'll probably be fine, because at that point the API is going to be stable, so you can add it to your project. Might be a little quirky here and there, but it should get you most of the way there. Now, if you want some resources, I have some links on the slides. The slides will be available right after the talk, so don't worry about that. So these are clickable links. If you want to read more about Google's requirements for the biometric options and how safe they have to be, the Measuring Biometric Unlock Security is the post you want for that. They go over what their minimum values are, how they kind of measure these things, and it's a really good read if you're interested. So last up, again, my name's Brian Gardner. Work for Big Nerd Ranch. Love coming out to talk at these things. Follow me on Twitter if you care. Those are my slides right there. So it's just bit.ly, it's DCSF, droidcon San Francisco, --bio-prompt. That'll take you to the GitHub page that I have for this. So it has a copy of my slides, and it also has the sample project I use to build all of these things. So it has the framework biometric prompt implementation for API 28. It has the Android X version for things lower than that. It has the first time flow and that main flow. So you can kind of go poke around in there and check it out. So yeah, thanks for coming to my talk, and I can take any questions. So the question is if there's a way to check to see if a new fingerprint has been added to the device and then basically force the user to sign in again. So I haven't seen that with the normal authentication flow, so if they sign in like that. I know for the crypto objects that they have, they're basically built in to where if a new fingerprint is added, either the cryptos get locked or they get trashed. So you basically have to go recreate them again for extra security like that. I'm not too sure about the regular authentication flow. There might be an API to hook into to like listen for new fingerprint additions and things like that, and then basically just sign the user out. That would be my best guess, but I haven't seen anything like that concretely. That's a good question. So the question was, if the device has other biometrics like iris scanning, which will it trigger? Will it trigger that or fingerprint or something like that? Effectively, that's up to the device manufacturer. So the biometric prompt is basically an API wrapper over what the hardware manufacturer implements. So in this case, Samsung, if they have like face and iris scanning, they can basically pick what the default biometric unlocked will be. So when the user brings it up, it might say, hey, like, give us your face or whatever, and we'll take a scan. But Google has also said that there will be a place in settings where users can go to. So if they want to use fingerprint instead, they can basically go and say, hey, no, I want to use fingerprint for unlock instead of like iris or face scanning. So it's up to the manufacturer, but users will still have control over what they want to use. So the question is if we can test it via instrumented tests. Honestly, I don't know. Probably not Espresso, because I don't think it works at that level. UI Automator might have something you can hook into for these kinds of verifications, but I haven't seen anything. Most likely, you would probably want to wrap the Biometric Prompt API over something, and then basically just like mock or fake that out inside of your test so you have more control over that.
If you're not on the login screen, I think this one doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is if you are not on the login screen and the like authentication fails, how do you fall back? So basically what you would do is either in the so in the framework version, you could override the cancel listener and then send the user to a login screen, or do it in the error callback. In the Android X version, you would do it in the error callback because we don't have the negative click listener anymore. So yeah, you would just say, hey, create a new intent for my login flow, and then just fire it off to go there. All right, well, if there aren't any more questions, thank you all for coming. I'll be around the conference as well if you have any more questions or comments. So thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your conference.